Why did everyone at the briefing table pretend she wasn't there? Emberlin Castellane stood near the back of the room, boots aligned perfectly, shoulders square, posture drilled into her long before the academy ever tried to shape her. She was smaller than the others, noticeably so. A freshman barely past her teens, swallowed by uniforms designed for bodies that filled space with ease. Conversations flowed around her like she was part of the wall. A few glances flicked her way. Curious, dismissive, amused. She told herself it didn't matter. But it always did. She had learned early that silence could be armor if you wore it long enough. Still, armor grew heavy when you carried it alone, especially when the whispers started. Tiny, pixie, freshman mistake. She kept her eyes forward, breathing measured, heart steady. The same way her grandfather taught her when the wind howled across the Montana range and the target seemed impossibly far away. They didn't know her. They didn't know why she was there. And she wasn't ready to tell them. Not yet. The first weeks at the academy were an education in humiliation. Obstacle courses built for reach, not technique. Group runs paced for stride, not cadence. Every failure became public. Every stumble turned into commentary. Ember learned to swallow embarrassment the way others swallowed water, quickly, silently, without reaction. At night, she stared at the photograph she kept hidden in her locker. A man in uniform, her father, his smile frozen in time, gone before she was old enough to understand what sacrifice meant. Gone in a place that still haunted her dreams even though she had never seen it with her own eyes. She didn't want pity. She didn't want approval. She wanted purpose. But doubt crept in anyway, quiet, persistent. The kind that waited until the lights were off and the world stopped watching. The kind that asked dangerous questions. What if they're right? What if I don't belong here? She never answered those questions aloud. Then came range day. The simplest test. The one everyone said was impossible to fail. Ember's hand shook when she lifted the service rifle, not from fear, from noise. Too many eyes, too many expectations. Her mind fought the weapon instead of becoming part of it. When the results came back, the silence was worse than laughter. Failure. She stood alone while the others avoided her gaze. The shame burned deeper than muscle fatigue ever could. It wasn't that she couldn't shoot. It was that she couldn't disappear. That night she almost quit. Almost. She held the photograph again, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Somewhere deep inside, a voice, old, steady, familiar, reminded her that storms didn't ask permission before they changed the landscape. 3 mornings later, before dawn, an instructor summoned her to an unauthorized range. No audience. No commentary. Just steel, distance, and silence. She lay behind a rifle that felt like memory. The weight was right, the balance familiar. The world narrowed, breathing slowed, and for the first time since arriving, the noise vanished. The shots landed exactly where they were meant to. That was when the engines arrived. 2 black vehicles rolled onto the gravel like shadows given form. The men who stepped out moved differently. Economical, intentional. They didn't look impressed easily, and when they looked at Ember, it wasn't with doubt. It was with recognition. One of them spoke her name like it already mattered. And in that moment, the story she thought she was living cracked open, revealing another one waiting beneath it. There was something they hadn't told her yet. But they would. Soon. What does it feel like to discover your life has been preparing you for a moment you never asked for? The folder was thin, too thin for what it carried. Ember opened it with steady hands. Inside was a photograph of a man she recognized without needing the name. The air left her lungs in a slow, silent collapse. Years of unanswered questions sharpened into a single image. This wasn't about her performance at the academy. This wasn't about tradition or potential. This was about timing. They told her the truth without decoration, A threat emerging, a city on edge, a target surrounded by civilians, politics, and consequences no drone could untangle. The only option was precision, patience, a shot that could not be rushed, could not be wrong. They told her why they had been watching her, why her grandfather trained her the way he did, why distance never frightened her, why stillness felt natural. She felt anger and pride, and something heavier than both. Joyce. She asked questions that mattered, about margins, about civilians, about what happened if the moment never came. The answers were honest. That made them worse. That night alone, she stared at the ceiling of the transport aircraft and felt doubt creep back in. Not about skill, about cost. Could she live with it? The story of her father came next, not as legend, as truth, a mission that went wrong, a man who stayed behind so others could escape, a silence that lasted longer than the gunfire ever did. She listened, she didn't cry, not yet. When they asked her if she could take the shot knowing who the man was, knowing what it meant, she didn't answer quickly. Then she nodded. Because some decisions aren't about what you want. They're about what you refuse to allow. The deployment was quiet. No ceremony, no applause, just movement from one shadow into another. The city greeted them with heat, noise, and life continuing as if history wasn't about to tilt. From the rooftop, the distance stretched between her and the compound like a held breath. She waited. Hours passed. The world shimmered. Her spotter spoke in calm murmurs. Wind changed its mind. The sun punished everything equally. Then the door opened. The target emerged. Not alone. A girl walked beside him, young, unaware, close enough that the margin vanished. Ember's finger stayed still. Time stretched thin. She waited. Because restraint is a form of courage, no one applauds. When separation finally came, it lasted seconds. That was all it took. The shot echoed once. Clean final. The city reacted instantly. Grief, confusion, noise rushing to fill the space where one man had stood. Ember didn't celebrate. She didn't feel relief. She watched a young girl collapse beside a fallen body and felt the weight of consequences settle into her bones. Mission success didn't erase humanity. It simply asked you to carry it. How quickly can silence turn into chaos? They were moving before the sound finished bouncing off the concrete. The exit was compromised. Someone had spoken when they shouldn't have. Streets filled with urgency. Shapes appeared where there had been none. The difference between control and survival shrank to seconds. Ember transitioned from precision to motion. The rifle that defined her gave way to a weapon meant for closeness, for decisions made without time to reflect. She followed orders, covered angles, trusted teammates she had met only days ago but now relied on completely. Fear arrived late and stayed quiet. The world narrowed again, but this time it wasn't still. It was loud, broken, unforgiving. She moved because stopping meant dying. She fired because hesitation meant someone else wouldn't make it home. When a threat appeared too close, she didn't freeze. She acted. And afterward, when there was no time to think, she understood something no range had ever taught her. Distance makes judgment easier. Proximity makes it honest. They reached the extraction point battered, wounded, intact only because each person carried more than their share. When the helicopters lifted, the city fell away beneath them, still alive, still complicated, still unchanged by one bullet and entirely altered by it. Only then did her hands start to shake. What do you say when the mission ends but the weight does? The hospital was quiet, too clean, too calm for what echoed inside her. She sat alone until a familiar voice joined her. Reassurance came carefully, praise without exaggeration, truth without softness. She confessed what lingered. Faces, moments, the permanence of it all. The response wasn't comfort, it was understanding. Later the call came. Her grandfather's voice was weaker than she remembered, honest in ways he had never allowed himself before. He told her what he had hidden, why he pushed, why he waited, why he let her walk into something he could no longer finish himself. She accused him. He didn't deny it. Love, he explained, sometimes looks like preparation instead of protection. She cried then, not because of the mission, because of time, because of endings that never ask permission. He told her to finish properly, to respect the process, to come home when it was done. She promised. What remains after everything changes? The debriefs erased her from official history. Words like unauthorized and classified wrapped the operation in silence. She listened. She answered. She accepted the cost of anonymity without protest. When it was over, she walked back onto academy grounds looking exactly the same as before. Small, quiet, easy to overlook. But something had shifted. When someone laughed at her size, it didn't reach her anymore. When eyes passed over her, she didn't feel erased. She had stood in places where names didn't matter, only actions did. She visited Montana weeks later, sat beside a bed, held a hand that had once steadied hers behind a rifle. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. He passed quietly. At the academy, life continued. Training, discipline, routine. Ember blended back into it without announcement. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need stories told about her. Because she knew something others didn't. Strength isn't volume. Courage isn't size. And dignity doesn't demand attention. Sometimes it doesn't speak at all. It simply acts. Why did the room feel smaller the moment she opened the folder? Emberlyn Castlane didn't sit down. She couldn't. The metal chair behind her felt like something temporary, like an object meant for people who believed they still had choices. The men across from her waited in silence, not rushing her, not filling the space with reassurance. That alone told her this was real. No one softened truth like this. Inside the folder, the photograph stared back with an indifference that felt almost insulting. A man in his early 50s, dark beard going gray, eyes that didn't apologize for anything they'd seen or done. The background was forgettable on purpose, concrete, sun-bleached, anonymous. A place that could be anywhere, a place designed not to matter. But the face mattered. Her throat tightened before her mind caught up. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways without realizing it, always dramatic, always loud. This was neither, just a photograph, just confirmation. So one of the men said quietly, "You recognize him?" Ember nodded once. It was all she trusted herself to do. They didn't say the name at first. They didn't need to. She had heard it her entire childhood, always spoken carefully, always followed by silence. The kind of silence adults used when they thought children weren't strong enough to carry the weight of truth. They told her why they were there. Not as an invitation, not as an order, as context. There was intelligence, fresh, credible, and narrowing fast. A man who disappeared for years at a time had resurfaced in a city that never truly slept. The threat wasn't theoretical. It had timelines, people, consequences that would ripple far beyond a single target, diplomatic buildings, civilian workers, lives that would never know why they were spared, if they were spared at all. Ember listened without interruption, hands clasped loosely in front of her, nails pressing crescents into her palms. The details mattered, distances, urban density, sightlines, collateral risk. She noticed how carefully they avoided certain words: assassination, revenge, closure. Instead, they said prevention, precision, last option. When they finally spoke her grandfather's name, something shifted in her chest. "He's been tracking this for years," the commander said. "Unofficially, quietly, he told us you'd be ready." Ember's jaw tightened. Ready was a dangerous word. Ready implied consent. Readiness implied choice. She asked the question anyway. "Ready for what exactly?" The answer came without drama. For a shot no one else can take. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Ember thought of the range at dawn, the unauthorized rifle, the way the world narrowed when no one was watching. She thought of how different it felt when pressure vanished, how stillness came easier than confidence ever had. They showed her imagery, satellite views, distances marked with clean lines and numbers, rooftops, windows, streets thick with humanity. This wasn't a battlefield where lines were drawn. This was life layered on top of itself, unpredictable and unforgiving. She asked about civilians. They answered honestly. She asked about abort conditions. They didn't lie. She asked what happened if the moment never came. That's the hardest part, someone said. Waiting. Waiting. Ember understood that better than they realized. The aircraft ride was long enough for doubt to find its footing. Engines hummed. Lights dimmed. The men around her moved with practiced ease. Slipping into sleep or quiet routines like this was just another transition between places. For Ember, it felt like standing on the edge of a thought she couldn't step away from. She replayed every range failure, every whispered insult, every moment she'd been told, directly or not, that she was too small for the uniform she wore. The irony pressed down on her now. All that doubt, and here she was being asked to carry something most people never even knew existed. She closed her eyes. Saw Montana. Cold mornings. Her grandfather's voice steady behind her shoulder, not correcting, not rushing, just waiting for her to feel it. The moment when breath slowed and the rifle stopped being an object and became an extension of intent. "Don't fight the world," he'd said once. "Let it settle, then move with it." When the commander approached her mid-flight, she sensed the weight of what he was about to say before he opened his mouth. "You deserve to know," he said quietly, "about your father." She didn't answer immediately. Part of her wanted to protect the version of him she carried, smiling, unbroken, untouched by the ugliness this world excelled at hiding. But she nodded. The story wasn't embellished. It didn't need to be. A mission that unraveled. A decision made in seconds that defined everything afterward. A man who stayed when leaving would have saved him. A silence that lasted longer than the fight. "He didn't give them anything," the commander said. "Not one thing." Ember stared at the metal floor beneath her boots, blinking slowly until the sting in her eyes faded. Pride and grief collided, leaving something raw and unresolved in their wake. That night when sleep finally came, it brought fragments instead of rest. Crosshairs drifting in heat shimmer. A door opening. A young girl's laughter echoing somewhere it didn't belong. Ember woke with her heart racing, breath shallow, the realization settling deeper with every mile traveled. This wasn't about revenge. If it were, it would be easier. They arrived quietly. No flags, no ceremony, just movement from shadow to shadow, blending into a city that had learned to absorb violence without stopping. From the safe house, Ember studied the environment the way she always had, without judgment, without emotion. Concrete absorbed heat differently than stone. Wind moved unpredictably through narrow streets. Life carried on inches away from places where it might end without warning. On the rooftop, time stretched. Hours passed with nothing but heat and sound. Vendors shouting, children playing. Somewhere a radio played music she didn't recognize. Ember lay prone, rifle aligned, breathing slow. Her spotter spoke softly, not because it was necessary, but because it felt respectful. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was waiting for alignment. When the door finally opened, Ember felt it before she saw it. A subtle tightening, a shift in focus. The world narrowing without her asking it to. The man stepped into the light. Not alone. A girl walked beside him, close enough that Ember's finger froze mid-breath. Blue fabric moved in the heat. Youth, proximity, humanity complicating geometry. "No shot," she whispered. They waited. Seconds stretched into something heavier. The girl laughed at something he said, a normal sound in an abnormal moment. Ember swallowed, forcing her breathing to slow again. This was the part no one trained you for, the part where numbers stopped mattering and judgment took over. Then the separation came. 6 feet. Enough. The rifle settled. Wind held steady. The world paused, not because it was kind, but because it didn't care either way. Ember squeezed. The sound was sharp and final, swallowed almost immediately by the city. She watched through the scope as the man fell, the moment unfolding without exaggeration, without mercy. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel relief. She felt weight. In the aftermath, as voices crackled and instructions came fast, Ember stayed still for half a second longer than necessary. Long enough to see the girl collapse beside the body. Long enough to understand that some victories arrived carrying their own ghosts. When she finally moved, it wasn't because she wanted to. It was because the world doesn't stop for reflection. Not even after history tilts. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet realization took root. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of what she would have to live with. How fast can control unravel when the city decides it has noticed you? The first shout came from 3 blocks away. Ember heard it through bone, not ears. A vibration carried by concrete and heat, by the instinct of crowds that sensed something had shifted before they understood why. Her spotter's hand tightened briefly on her shoulder, not fear, not urgency. Confirmation. Compromised, he said, calm as breath. Move. She rolled away from the rifle without ceremony, muscle memory taking over where thought would have slowed her down. The weapon was secured, dismantled with efficient precision, every motion practiced until it no longer belonged to doubt. She didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury for people who expected to stay. The stairwell smelled like dust and old water. Their boots hit concrete in rhythm, not rushed, not careless. Outside, the city surged, confused rather than angry, the way it always did before truth caught up with consequence. Doors opened. Heads turned. Phones rose into the air like offerings to a god of uncertainty. Ember moved through it like a shadow, pretending to be human. They had planned for this. Planned for 10 different versions of it, actually. What they hadn't planned for was the speed. Someone had spoken too soon, or noticed too much, or simply guessed right. The reason didn't matter now. Reasons never did when clocks started ticking. At street level, the soundscape changed. Sirens in the distance. Engines revving where they shouldn't have been. The soft murmur of a city pretending nothing was wrong, layered over the sharper edge of panic. Split, the team lead said quietly. Ember didn't argue, she never did. She peeled off into an alley so narrow the buildings leaned toward each other like conspirators. Trash bins, broken glass, a stray cat frozen in surprise. Her breath stayed even. Her heart didn't race. Fear arrived late, as it always did, polite, patient, waiting for permission she never granted. A man stepped into her path without warning. He wasn't armed, not visibly. His eyes were wide, searching her face for something, answers, maybe, or a reason to be afraid. Ember didn't slow. She shifted just enough to slip past him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Sorry," she said softly, automatically. The word surprised her, not because it wasn't true, but because it came so easily. She wondered briefly how many apologies she had given in her life for simply existing in spaces others thought she didn't belong. The sound of gunfire cracked somewhere behind her. Not close. Not yet. Ember ducked through a doorway, heart rate finally spiking as the reality of proximity set in. This was no longer about distance and patience. This was about seconds, about corners, about choices that didn't come with time to weigh them. She checked her weapon. Good, moved again. A vehicle screeched to a halt at the end of the street. Doors slammed. Voices rose, sharp and directional. Ember pressed herself into the shadow of a stairwell, counting breaths. 1, 2, 3. She remembered her grandfather's voice not as instruction but as presence. "Don't fight the world, let it settle." The men ran past her without seeing her, close enough that she smelled sweat and dust, close enough that the air shifted in their wake. Ember waited until the moment passed, then slipped out the opposite direction, merging with the crowd like she had always done best. She became smaller on purpose. A woman carrying groceries bumped into her, muttering something irritated. Ember nodded apologetically, took 2 steps back, then 3 forward, adjusting pace to match the street. She lowered her gaze, relaxed her shoulders. The uniform beneath her jacket disappeared beneath posture alone. This was another kind of skill, one no range ever taught. At the rendezvous point, things were already unraveling. One teammate was down, not dead, but bleeding, leg caught by debris when a door exploded outward. The medic worked quickly, hands sure, voice calm. Ember dropped to a knee without being asked, scanning angles, covering the street with a focus that burned everything else away. A car surged toward them too fast. "Stop!" someone shouted. It didn't. Ember adjusted without thinking. The shot was close, loud, unforgiving. The windshield shattered, the vehicle veering sideways into a stall of fruit that exploded into color and noise. Screams followed. Chaos bloomed. And in the middle of it, Ember felt something snap inside her. Not fear. Expectation. This was the moment no one talked about. The moment when lines blurred and the world shrank until all that mattered was keeping the people beside you alive. She moved forward, dragging the injured man with help from another teammate, muscles screaming in protest she ignored. They reached the secondary extraction point under pressure, breathless but intact. The helicopter arrived low and fast, rotors kicking dust and debris into the air. Ember climbed last, pulling herself up with hands that finally trembled now that the worst of it had passed. Inside the aircraft, no one spoke at first. The medic continued working. Someone laughed once, sharp, disbelieving, on the edge of hysteria, then went quiet again. Ember sat with her back against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing, replaying moments she hadn't chosen to remember but couldn't stop seeing. The car. The glass. The sound. Her hands shook harder now. She pressed them together, grounding herself in pressure, in sensation, in reality. This was the cost of proximity. This was what distance had spared her from before. The commander caught her eye across the cabin. He didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Acknowledgement without praise. That mattered more than words. When they landed, the world felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. As if everything had decided to pause out of respect or indifference, she couldn't tell which. Ember walked off the aircraft on legs that didn't quite feel like her own. The debrief room was dim, cool, neutral by design. They spoke in measured tones, dissecting events the way surgeons did, separating emotion from outcome. Ember answered when addressed, short, precise. She left out what didn't fit into checkboxes. No one asked how it felt to fire at close range. No one asked about the apology in the alley. Afterward, alone in a narrow hallway, Ember finally leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Her breath hitched once, then again. She pressed her forehead to the cool surface, grounding herself in the present. She hadn't frozen. She hadn't failed. So why did it feel like something essential had been lost? The answer came slowly, unwelcome but undeniable. Because she had crossed a line she could never step back over. Distance had given her space to think, to rationalize, to frame actions as necessity. Up close, there was no framing, no story to tell yourself that made it lighter. There was only consequence, immediate and personal. That night's sleep refused her. When it finally came, it brought fragments again. The girl on the street, the man in the alley, the car that didn't stop. Faces blending into each other until she couldn't separate memory from fear. She woke before dawn, heart racing. the realization settling heavy and cold in her chest. This mission hadn't just tested her skill. It had tested her identity. And for the first time since she arrived at the academy, Ember wasn't sure who she was becoming, or whether she was ready to accept the answer. Outside, the city began to wake, unaware of how close it had come to something worse. Inside, Ember lay still, staring at the ceiling, understanding something fundamental at last. Survival wasn't the same as victory. And sometimes, the hardest part of a mission began only after you made it home. What do you do when the noise finally stops, but your mind refuses to? The room they gave her was too quiet. No engines, no radios, no footsteps rushing past doors, just a narrow bed, a single chair, and a window that didn't quite open all the way. Ember sat on the edge of the mattress with her boots still on, hands resting on her thighs like she was waiting for instructions that never came. Her body understood rest. Her mind didn't trust it. Every time she closed her eyes, the city came back. Not the chaos, not the gunfire. The small things. A vendor's hands shaking as he gathered fruit from the ground. The sound of glass settling after it shattered. The way the injured teammate had tried to joke through clenched teeth while the medic worked on him. These details pressed in, uninvited, refusing to be sorted into before and after. She had been trained to compartmentalize. No one had told her the compartments could leak. A knock came softly at the door. Ember opened it to find the commander standing there, posture relaxed, eyes tired in a way rank couldn't hide. He didn't ask to come in. He waited. "I'm fine," she said automatically. He studied her for a moment, then nodded, as if she had answered a different question entirely. "Debrief in 30, he said. "No pressure, say what you can, leave what you can't." After he left, Ember sat back down, the word fine echoing in her head like a lie that had learned to sound convincing. She wondered when she had started using it that way. Maybe she always had. The debrief was methodical, clean, time-stamped. Events placed in order, stripped of emotion until they resembled something manageable. Ember spoke when prompted, her voice steady, her answers precise. She described movements, angles, decisions. She did not describe hesitation. She did not describe the apology. No one asked. When it ended, she expected relief. Instead, she felt exposed, like the truth had passed too close without being acknowledged, leaving a draft behind. Hours later, a call came through on a secure line. Her grandfather's voice filled the small room, thinner than she remembered, edged with something that sounded like relief and fear tangled together. "So," he said softly, "you crossed the line." Ember swallowed. "I didn't have a choice." There was a pause, long enough to matter. "You always do," he replied. "You just don't always like the options." She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear him until that moment. The words loosened something in her chest, and suddenly the control she'd been gripping all day slipped. "It was closer than I thought," she admitted. "Everything." "I know." Not sympathy, understanding. He didn't ask for details. He never had. He asked instead about the wind, about her breathing, about whether she remembered to listen instead of force. "I did," she said, "when it mattered." "Good," he murmured. "Then you did your job." She wanted to tell him about the girl, about the weight that hadn't lifted, but the words stayed lodged somewhere between her throat and her pride. She didn't want to be comforted. She wanted to be honest, and honesty felt dangerous right now. They ended the call quietly. That night, Ember dreamed of distance. Wide valleys, endless sky, targets so far away they felt abstract again. When she woke, there was a hollow ache behind her ribs, like something essential had been misplaced while she slept. The medical evaluation came next. Questions asked gently, reactions noted carefully. Ember answered the way she always had, truth wrapped in restraint. She admitted to disrupted sleep, to replayed moments, to tension she couldn't quite release. She did not admit to fear. The doctor didn't push. "Give it time," she said. "Some things settle, some don't. The important part is noticing which is which." Time, Ember nodded, unsure whether she believed in it anymore. 2 days later, she was cleared to return. No ceremony, no announcement, just a transport back to the academy that felt like rewinding a tape that had already been damaged. The familiar gates came into view, unchanged, indifferent to everything that had happened beyond them. Students moved across the grounds in clusters, laughing, complaining, competing. Ember stepped into their orbit quietly, her duffel slung over one shoulder, her presence once again easy to overlook. For a moment, that hurt more than she expected. Then she realized something else. It didn't matter. In the weeks that followed, she trained harder than before, not to prove anything, but because movement was the only way her thoughts stayed aligned. On the range, her shots tightened. In drills, her timing sharpened. In silence, she learned where the noise still lived. Others noticed eventually. An instructor paused longer than usual behind her firing lane. A classmate stopped making jokes. A few began asking questions, careful ones, respectful ones. Ember answered politely, vaguely. She wasn't interested in mythology. One afternoon, during a routine exercise, a younger cadet froze under pressure. Panic crept into his movements, hesitation stacking on hesitation. Ember recognized it instantly, the moment when the world feels too loud and your body forgets how to listen. Without raising her voice, she moved closer. "Breathe," she said. "Don't fight it." The cadet did, slowly, then again. Later, he thanked her with a look that carried more relief than words ever could. Ember nodded, feeling something unexpected take root. Purpose. Not the kind tied to missions or outcomes. The quieter kind. Another call came weeks later, this one different, shorter, heavier. Her grandfather was declining faster now. She went home. The mountains greeted her like they always had, unchanged, patient, unconcerned with human timelines. She sat beside his bed and held his hand, noticing how the grip that once guided hers now relied on her strength instead. "I always knew you'd go farther than me," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't know how far." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she wasn't sure she wanted to go anywhere at all. Instead, she squeezed his hand. "You taught me how to be still," she said. "That's what saved me." He smiled faintly. "Stillness isn't absence," he replied. "It's choice." He passed that night quietly without drama. Ember sat with him until morning. Grief arrived without warning. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just heavy enough to change the way everything else felt. She carried it back with her, folded neatly alongside everything else she didn't talk about. At the academy, life continued. But Ember had changed. Not visibly, not in ways people could point to. She still stood a little apart, still spoke softly, still didn't demand space. Yet when she moved, there was certainty now. When she looked at a challenge, there was patience instead of doubt. She no longer wondered if she belonged. She knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the range fell quiet, Ember lingered after training. She lay prone, breathing slow, watching the wind move grass at the edge of her vision. Distance stretched out in front of her. Not as escape, as perspective. She understood now that strength didn't erase weight. It taught you how to carry it. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was intention. And that some lines once crossed didn't diminish you. They defined you. As she packed up and walked back toward the lights of the academy, Ember felt something unfamiliar but welcome settle into place. Not pride. Not closure. Acceptance. And with it a quiet resolve. Whatever came next, missions or none at all, she would meet it the same way she always had. Calm. Present. unseen if necessary. Because sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones everyone notices. They're the ones who learn how to live with what no one else ever sees. What happens when the world moves on, but something inside you stays alert? Ember noticed it first in the quiet moments, the spaces between commands, the pauses after laughter. When everyone else relaxed, she stayed just a fraction too aware, like a door left slightly open no matter how safe the room felt. It wasn't fear exactly. It was readiness that no longer knew where to rest. Weeks passed, training cycles reset, new faces arrived, old rivalries softened into routines. From the outside, Ember blended back into academy life so completely that anyone watching would have assumed nothing had changed. She still ran her laps, still shot her lanes, still spoke only when spoken to. But something had shifted beneath the surface. She no longer trained to be seen. She trained to be precise. There was a difference, and she felt it every time she settled into position. Her breathing found its rhythm faster now. Her body remembered stillness without effort. When instructors corrected others, they watched Ember differently, not critically, but curiously, as if measuring something they hadn't expected to find. She didn't let herself enjoy that. Enjoyment felt dangerous. One afternoon, during a joint exercise, a visiting evaluation team arrived unannounced. Their presence changed the air immediately. Cadets straightened, voices lowered, mistakes carried weight again. Ember felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not anxiety but recognition. This was how it always began. The scenario was simple on paper, complex in execution, urban simulation, split teams, limited information, the kind of exercise designed to expose habits under pressure. Ember was assigned to a unit she'd never worked with before. She took her place without comment. At first, no one listened to her. Suggestions went unheard, warnings dismissed politely, then ignored. The old frustration stirred, familiar and sharp. For a moment she considered pushing harder, raising her voice, forcing attention. She didn't. Instead, she adjusted. She covered angles others forgot, watched doors no one assigned, counted steps, exits, timing. When the simulated threat emerged where she had predicted, the team froze just long enough for her quiet correction to redirect them. Afterward, no one mocked her size. They didn't praise her either. They just started listening. That night, alone in her room, Ember sat on the floor with her back against the bed and let the day replay. Not the success, the restraint. The choice not to demand space but to earn it without asking. She felt something close to pride, then gently set it aside. Pride could make you careless. Sleep came unevenly. Dreams drifted in fragments again, but softer now, less insistent. When she woke, she didn't feel whole, but she felt capable. That was new. The message arrived 2 days later. Encrypted, brief, official. Her name, a time, a location. No explanation. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, feeling the old tension coil in her stomach. This wasn't fear. It was anticipation edged with reluctance. She had wondered if this moment would come. She just hadn't known when or how she would feel when it did. The meeting took place off campus in a building that pretended to be ordinary. The same commander sat across from her, his expression neutral but intent. No folder this time, no photographs. "You did well," he said simply. Ember nodded once. She didn't thank him. "There may be another operation," he continued. "Different scope, different risks. We're not asking yet, we're informing." The word asking lingered between them. She appreciated that more than he probably realized. "Before anything moves forward," he added, "we need to know something, not about your skill, about you." She waited. "Why are you still here?" The question landed harder than any test ever had. Ember didn't answer immediately. She thought of her grandfather, of the city, of the academy grounds at dusk, of the cadet who'd frozen and breathed again because she'd stayed calm. "I don't want to disappear," she said finally, "and I don't want to be loud." The commander watched her closely, then nodded. "That's what we hoped you'd say." She left the building with more questions than answers. The future stretched ahead of her again, uncertain and demanding. For the first time, she didn't resent that. Back at the academy, news spread quietly. An instructor retired unexpectedly. A slot opened in an advanced track few freshmen ever saw. Ember's name appeared on a list without ceremony. Some noticed, some didn't. A few whispered. She ignored all of it. The advanced training pushed her harder than anything before. Longer hours, less margin, more responsibility. Mistakes carried consequences now, not humiliation but accountability. Ember welcomed it. This kind of pressure didn't bruise her ego, it sharpened her focus. One evening, after a particularly punishing day, she stayed behind on the range as the sun sank low. The light stretched long across the ground, shadows deepening with every minute. She lay prone, breathing slow, the world narrowing into familiar calm. She didn't fire. She just watched the wind. In that stillness, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think before. She wasn't trying to redeem anything. Not her father. Not her past. Not herself. She was choosing alignment. To act when action mattered. To wait when waiting saved lives. To speak only when words carried weight. The call came weeks later. This time it wasn't encrypted, it wasn't urgent. It was personal. The commander's voice carried a tone she hadn't heard before, respect, edged with caution. "We're moving forward," he said, "only if you're willing." Ember closed her eyes. She thought of the line she had crossed, of the weight she carried without complaint, of the way the academy felt smaller now, not confining but complete, like a chapter nearing its natural end. "Yes," she said, not quickly, not dramatically, just honestly. After the call, she sat alone for a long time, not preparing, not rehearsing, just being present in the decision she had made. She felt the familiar mix of resolve and uncertainty, but something else too. Peace. Not because the path was easy. Because it was chosen. Outside, the academy lights flickered on as night settled in. Life continued. Cadets laughed somewhere in the distance. Someone argued about nothing important. The world remained stubbornly ordinary. Ember stood, shouldered her bag, and stepped back into it without hesitation. She understood now that strength wasn't proven in moments of spectacle. It was revealed in consistency, in restraint, in the quiet willingness to step forward again, not because you were unafraid, but because you understood the cost and accepted it anyway. And whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she always had. With eyes open, with breath steady, with dignity that didn't need permission to exist. What does it mean to belong when no one is watching? The night before she left, Ember walked the perimeter of the academy alone. The lights cast long shadows across the training grounds, stretching familiar shapes into something almost unrecognizable. She moved slowly, not because she was tired, but because she wanted to remember it exactly as it was. The sound of gravel under her boots, the faint echo of laughter from a distant barracks, the flag at the center of the ground stirring gently in the wind. This place had once felt like a test she wasn't sure she could pass. Now it felt like a foundation. She stopped near the range, resting her hand briefly on the cool metal of the gate. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. Some spaces lived in you long after you left them. She understood that now. Her room was already packed, simple, efficient. She had learned not to carry more than necessary, not in gear, not in memory. As she sat on the edge of the bed one last time, she felt the quiet weight of what she was stepping into. Not excitement. Responsibility. Sleep came easily for the first time in months. When she woke, there were no dreams waiting for her, no fragments clawing at the edges of her thoughts, just clarity, clean and calm. The transport arrived before dawn. No one made speeches. No one gathered to see her off. That was intentional. This kind of work didn't begin with applause. It began with absence. Ember climbed aboard without looking back, the academy fatting behind her as the road curved away into the early morning light. The new operation was quieter than the last. Different terrain, different culture, different rhythm. Ember absorbed it all without judgment, learning the way she always had by listening more than speaking. She wasn't the smallest one anymore. She wasn't the newest either, but she still didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. The team adjusted around her naturally, not because of rank or reputation, but because trust forms fastest around consistency. Ember became the one who noticed shifts in the wind before they mattered, the one who waited an extra second when others rushed, the one who spoke softly and only when it counted. One night during a long overwatch, a teammate asked her why she never talked about herself. Ember considered the question as she watched the horizon breathe in and out with the heat. "Some things don't get lighter when you say them out loud," she replied. He nodded, understanding more than he said. The mission unfolded without spectacle. No dramatic turns, no moments that demanded legend, just a sequence of decisions made correctly, patiently, one after another. Lives protected not because someone was brave in a visible way, but because someone stayed still when stillness mattered most. When it was over, there was no surge of relief, just a quiet settling, like dust after a storm that never quite announced itself. On the flight back, Ember stared out the small window as clouds passed beneath them. She thought of her grandfather's hands guiding hers, of her father's choice to stay, of the girl in the city who would grow up never knowing how close everything came to changing. She felt the familiar weight. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like inheritance. Back home, the academy welcomed her the same way it always had, by barely noticing. She stepped back into routine without ceremony. Training, mentorship, long days that ended quietly. She watched younger cadets struggle with the same doubts she once carried, saw herself reflected in their hesitation. When they asked her how to endure it, she never gave speeches. She showed them. By being steady. By being patient. By proving that you didn't have to be the loudest presence in the room to change its direction. Months later, during a final evaluation, an instructor asked her a question she hadn't expected. "What drives you?" Ember paused. Not because she didn't know. Because she wanted to answer honestly. "Responsibility," she said, "and restraint." The instructor studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Those last longer than ambition," he replied. On the day she graduated, the sky was clear. Families gathered, cameras flashed, names were called. Ember stood among them, posture perfect, expression calm. When her name echoed across the field, there was no cheer that rose above the others, no dramatic reaction. She didn't need one. As she accepted her insignia, she felt a quiet pride, not in what she had survived, but in what she had become without surrendering herself to bitterness or noise. Later, alone, she visited the range one last time before leaving the grounds for good. She lay prone, breathing slow, letting the wind move the world instead of fighting it. She didn't fire a single round. She smiled, because she understood something now that had once felt just out of reach. Strength wasn't about proving people wrong. It wasn't about being chosen or noticed or validated. It was about choosing to act with care when no one was watching. About holding steady when the world rushed. About carrying weight without demanding recognition for it. As Ember stood and walked away, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground she no longer needed to conquer. She had already done the harder thing. She had learned who she was in the quiet, and she knew now that dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need applause. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts.